Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called The Hero's Daughter Avoids the Death Flag. Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. Thank you for watching. The Lindhagen Duke's mansion is a majestic Baroque palace surrounded by manicured gardens and elegant fountains. The building's facade is decorated with elegant stucco, columns, and massive windows with heavy curtains. The central part of the house is distinguished by a balcony with wrought iron railings. The Duke's servants stood frozen in front of the ornate doors, awaiting orders. Two of the maids whispered, stealing glances at each other, while the others kept their bearing, looking straight ahead. The gilded patterns on the glass cast soft reflections, creating a solemn atmosphere. The two maids began to talk among themselves, feeling sorry for the madam, since her husband had not even come to support her during the birth. However, the other one replied that there was no point in that. But another maid explained her words by saying that the man is a national hero after all, and that means a lot. He just doesn't have enough time. The other one replied that she understood everything and added in an alarmed tone that Madame had a very weak body. Suddenly, the maids were interrupted by screams coming from the room where the woman was. All the girls froze in surprise and horror, each worried about her mistress. Inside the room was a woman lying motionless on a bed under a blanket. The room was decorated in blue tones, which gave it a soft and luxurious feel. The walls were exquisitely decorated, as was the bed itself. Dozens of maids fussed around the mistress, concerned about her condition. The woman had fairly long blonde hair, but her face looked sickly, causing sympathy in everyone who looked at her. Her eyes were bright green. Some girl screamed loudly, addressing her. She was addressed by a maid whose appearance suggested that she was already quite grown up. Holding the baby in her arms, she announced with a smile that the birth had been successful. With the same joy, the girl added that the woman had given birth to a healthy girl. The child looked wonderful. She had golden hair and light brown eyelashes, which made her look cute. When she heard these words, I immediately got out of bed and reached for the child. She immediately looked much better and happier. She gently took the baby in her arms and stroked the girl's head, and said that she already knew what to name her. The woman was about to say the baby's name when suddenly her hand quietly dropped onto the blanket, as if she had stopped breathing. This frightened the maid very much. Her face reflected deep concern for her mistress. Her heart began to beat faster, and her breathing became intermittent. When the girl realized the whole situation, her condition worsened sharply, engulfing her in a wave of panic and anxiety. In the mistress's room, the maids ran around in panic, trying to do something, and loudly called for the doctor. No one expected such a sudden and terrible turn of events. The girls could not believe what was happening, and the one who stood closest to the hostess screamed in despair, trying to bring the lady to her senses. Suddenly, a dark-haired maid came up to her. She loudly declared that she would take the child and then ordered her to immediately run for the doctor and tell everything. In a panic, she only nodded and hurried to carry out the order. The girl immediately handed the baby over to another maid and hurried out of the room, thanking her colleague for staying. The girl smiled slyly at the baby, but there was no warmth or care in that smile. It looked sinister, cold, and even frightening, as if something dark and unkind lurked in her thoughts. The maid called the doctor, and they hurriedly went to the mistress's room, overcome with anxiety. However, at the same time, the other girl, holding the child in her arms, began to slowly retreat. And then the door slammed shut, and suddenly the room was silent. No more screams, no more panic, just an oppressive silence. The maid continued to move swiftly down the corridor with the baby in her arms, not paying attention to anything or anyone around her. All her attention was focused on getting out of sight as quickly as possible. It was raining outside, its noise drowning out all other sounds. And inside the room, the girl quietly told the baby that she was incredibly lucky to be born into the Duke's family, but unlucky to fall into her arms. She also added with a sly smile that the baby was very poor, but her words sounded in such a way that it was easy to understand her true intentions. She continued walking down the corridor and added with a smile that they had probably already thought of a wonderful name for the Duke's daughter, hiding a certain ironic note behind the words. And so, after a short pause, she added that only the little girl would never know her true name. Near her shoulder was visible a small red rose, a kind of birthmark symbolizing her belonging to the ducal blood. 12 years passed. People worked in the wheat field, carrying heavy boxes of food. Under the scorching sun, it was incredibly hard work, but no one pitied them, and no one promised relief. On the ground lay boxes, bags, and stones, which people had to later carry to the right place where they were needed for work. And so, the poor people in shabby clothes continued to carry heavy bags under the scorching sun. On their feet were iron shackles, which brought even more discomfort and pain, making each step excruciating. The girl, judging by her clothes, also walked with difficulty, working under the scorching sun. On her fragile and small legs hung huge shackles, which made her steps even more difficult and painful. She carried a heavy bag, literally suffocating from its weight. Large beads of sweat glistened on her face, quickly running down her cheeks, mixing with dirt and fatigue. She fell to the ground with difficulty, quietly whispering to herself that she could not go on any longer. Her body refused to move, and her spirit was on the verge of breaking. She raised her head and quietly added that she couldn't even feel her legs. At that moment, a man appeared next to her, whose clothes were new and clean, unlike hers, which were worn and dirty. The man angrily hit her with a whip and sharply ordered her not to stand on lock number 5, causing the girl to scream loudly in pain. A wound soon appeared on her back, blood slowly soaking through her clothes. But he continued to shout, adding that slaves had no business getting rich and thinking about what was due to them. He ordered the girl to leave quickly. She rose to her feet with difficulty, making strange, suppressed sounds of pain, and, staggering, took a few steps forward. The other man was already having fun, and together they continued to shout that they had no time to mess around with the slave. They said that they were giving the girl a reason to live and that she should appreciate it. The girl nevertheless took the bag and continued to walk forward, but her teeth were clenched from heaviness and anger, and pain and hatred were visible in her eyes. She thought about their words and decided that in the end it was up to her to decide how to live. Anger gave her the strength to move forward, despite the pain and fatigue. The girl thought that she had been alone since birth. It seemed to her that there was nothing to lose and nothing to be afraid of. These thoughts made her feel even worse, and her heart sank from emptiness. The girl also thought that she would never let these men win. She decided that she would only become stronger and more resilient, despite everything she would have to endure. She believed that one day she would leave here, that it would definitely come true, because she could not allow her life to be reduced to this. It was a dark night outside, but the room she was in was not old or luxurious at all. It was an ordinary 2-story house, quite large. There was a light in one of the windows, as if someone was still inside. The girl walked down the corridor, mentally repeating to herself that her whole body ached and she wouldn't even be able to sleep. Suddenly, she heard voices behind the doors. Someone was talking, and there was something disturbing in this conversation. She listened and heard the man say that the girl could be considered closed. These words aroused her curiosity, and she couldn't help but wonder what exactly was being discussed. She looked through the crack in the door and saw 2 men, one old, with a wrinkled face, and the other much younger, with a determined expression on his face. Her gaze suddenly became much more frightened, as if she had not at all expected to see what was unfolding before her. This grown man was a buyer of children and slaves, and his appearance was so terrifying that it was impossible not to feel a chill of fear. His stern face and cold eyes spoke volumes. The girl realized with horror that all the children he bought were found dead a few days later. This thought penetrated her consciousness, and her heart sank with fear. The girl was sure that this man himself killed all the children and slaves that he bought. Every look of his, every word of his caused her a feeling of horror and misunderstanding. He said with a big smile that this time he wanted to buy that beautiful girl because he had his eye on her for a long time. He added that he would take care of her, for sure, as if it was the most ordinary and harmless thing. She stood behind the door, and the thought flashed through her mind that the owner had sold another child to this pervert. She needed to find him before anyone else and get out of here before it was too late. He asked where the cutie was, became a little worried, and then apologized as if his concern was just a temporary misunderstanding. He replied that number 5 was sleeping now, and if he wanted, the guy could wake her up. The girl heard these words with horror, realizing that her life could change at any moment. Suddenly, the door creaked, attracting the attention of everyone in the room. All eyes immediately switched to her, and the tension in the air became even stronger. The man angrily shouted who was there, and the girl stood in the doorway, frightened, feeling the weight of the whole situation. Her chest was constricted with fear, and she felt how every moment could be decisive. The girl stood there, frightened and confused, not understanding what to do in this situation. Every moment seemed decisive, and she could not find the strength or courage for the next step. Her master stood up from the sofa and said that she had arrived just in time. A sly smile appeared on the men's faces, full of ominous anticipation, which only increased the girl's fear. He came closer to her and, smiling mockingly, told her to be happy, because now she would serve this gentleman. There was confidence in his voice, and his gaze was full of contempt. But the girl, filled with despair, rushed to run with all her might, so fast that the man did not have time to react. In her eyes burned the last spark of hope, and she was not going to give up without a fight. The girl ran, her heart pounding in her chest and her thoughts racing. She understood that if the man caught her, she would be finished. This pervert would definitely not spare her, and would probably kill her. Fear was her only companion at that moment. The girl ran without looking back and suddenly crashed into a man in a black robe. She screamed in fear, feeling fear grip her, and her body tensed in anticipation of a blow or punishment. A gentle hand grabbed her shoulder, stopping her as if to prevent her from escaping. Fear gripped her again, but this man was not aggressive. His touch was soft, almost soothing. The girl looked at their faces in fear, realizing that there was not one person in a black robe in front of her, but two. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt anxiety fill her body, not knowing what their appearance meant for her. The girl was surprised by this turn of events, because she couldn't even understand who these people were. Could they really be the servants of that pervert? Thoughts were racing through her head, but she couldn't find an answer. She only felt growing anxiety. Arms reached out to her, trying to embrace her, but she screamed in panic, begging to be let go. Fear and despair overwhelmed her, and she struggled with all her might against what seemed to her a threat. But still, her chin was lifted and she was forced to look the man straight in the eyes. His gaze was cold and calm, but something in it made her feel that this moment could be decisive for her. The girl saw blue eyes, just like hers, and light hair. It seemed strange and unexpected to her. She could not understand why she was so attracted to these features, so similar to her own. He said that he had finally found her, and there was confidence in his voice, as if it were a big deal. But the girl began to resist furiously. Her heart was beating wildly, and she was not going to give in. He hugged her tenderly and said that he had been looking for her for a long time, calling the girl his daughter. These words stunned her, and chaos began in her head. She could not believe that this man could be her father. The girl was very surprised by what was happening. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not understand how this was possible. Everything she knew about herself now seemed to be in question, and she did not know how to react to these words. The other man in the robe was much shorter and had black hair. He said in a soft voice that they would not hurt her and that she was safe. His words calmed the girl down a little, but there was still anxiety. He said that the man in front of her was Duke Victor Lindhagen, and the man began to remove the hood of his robe, revealing his face. The girl watched him in surprise, not believing her eyes. They also told her that he was her father. Tears began to gather in the man's eyes, and his face expressed a deep emotion that she could not immediately understand. The girl looked at the man. Her mind could not accept this reality. She could not believe that this man was her father. Everything seemed too impossible, and her face reflected complete confusion and bewilderment. Suddenly, another man's voice was heard asking if it was the Duke and if he thought his son was with him. The question was full of caution, and the girl felt the tension in the room increase. The older man asked with a grin if he wanted to buy a slave too, adding that the girl was already his. There was mockery in his voice, and the girl felt a chill run down her spine. The Duke extended his hand and showed 3 fingers. The gesture was incomprehensible to anyone in the room, and everyone froze, trying to figure out its meaning. He added that he would pay 3 times more for the girl and that he would not give up his daughter, hugging her with one arm as if protecting her from the whole world. His words were full of determination. The man who owned all the slaves happily repeated his words because the main price was important to him. He smiled like a man who had almost reached his goal, not paying attention to the emotions of others. The Duke declared that he could take the girl, and his words caused a storm of emotions in the old man, who could not calm down. He continued to be indignant, but he understood that an important person stood before him. The man shouted that he had bought the girl first and tried to grab her. His eyes were blazing with anger, and his actions were becoming more and more threatening. His actions were observed by the guy who had also been standing in the robe earlier. His face was neutral, but his eyes followed his every movement, as if he was expecting something. He slowly put his foot under the man to stop him. The man lost his balance and fell to the ground, making a sound that broke the silence in the room. At this time, the guy in the robe, showing no emotion, stood next to him. The old man lay on the ground in terror, his legs thrown forward, trying to regain his balance. His face was distorted with fear and pain, and his eyes looked at those around him with panic. The boy turned to him and in an angry voice told him not to touch his father with his dirty hands. There was such determination in his words that the man on the ground, although he tried to get up, froze in fear. The atmosphere in the room became tense. The girl looked at everything that was happening in surprise because it was simply amazing. She could not believe that her life had suddenly changed so much, and her head was full of mixed feelings. From fear to confusion. He, the Duke, patted the boy on the shoulder and said that the rest was on Ricardo. His tone of voice was calm and confident, as if he knew that he trusted this man. The Duke picked up the girl and said that they were done here and would now move on. His voice was full of determination, and he, not paying attention to the surroundings, confidently headed towards the exit. The Duke said that the girl was very light and needed to eat more, which made her a little embarrassed. She looked at him, not knowing how to react to these words. The boy watched his father and his daughter with some sadness. His gaze was thoughtful, as if he felt out of place in this new, bright picture. He could not understand what exactly caused such feelings in him. The girl, walking down the corridor with the Duke, cried out that she could not be his daughter, because her father was already dead. Her voice trembled with excitement and pain, and she felt a pain in her chest from the memories. He took her hand tighter and said that the girl looked very much like his late wife. His words were quiet, but full of deep emotion, as if he himself had not expected to remember this so suddenly. He asked her if she had a rose-shaped birthmark on her neck. The girl realized it was true when her fingers involuntarily touched the very same spot. The Duke explained that this was proof that she was his daughter, as he had the same birthmark. He slowly looked at her face, seeing how she was beginning to realize the seriousness of his words. The girl was amazed by everything that was happening. Her mind could not keep up with the flow of thoughts, and she could not understand how this was possible. The black-haired boy probably had the same birthmark, the girl thought. The thought struck her like lightning, and she began searching her memory for the boy's image. But the Duke refuted all her thoughts, saying that he had no birthmark at all, which surprised the girl very much. She looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding how this was possible. The Duke opened the doors to the street, but the girl was in her thoughts, because the boy had just called this man father. All her feelings and thoughts were intertwined into one big mess. The girl became increasingly aware that the life that had been taken from her after birth was full of secrets and hidden reasons. She began to understand that her past, which she had thought was lost, was closely connected to this man. The Duke extended his hand to the girl, and she thought that the life she had lost was finally beginning. In his gaze, she saw not only strength and confidence, but also the promise of something new. The carriage drove on, and they found themselves in a wonderful garden. Everything around was like something out of a fairy tale. Huge trees with lush greenery, flowering bushes, and alleys decorated with climbing plants. The Duke extended his hand to the girl so that she could leave. She looked at his outstretched hand with some hesitation, but then, feeling the warmth and confidence in his gesture, she took it. The Duke turned to the girl and told her that this was her home from now on, a place where she could be safe and where she no longer had to be afraid. She stood in amazement, looking at the majestic walls of the palace, realizing that her life was beginning to change. All the servants standing in the corridor of the palace lowered their heads with anxiety and respect, meeting the girl with a look full of reverence. It seemed that they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Her return. The girl looked around, amazed by the grandeur of the palace and its luxury. Her thoughts jumped from one amazing element to another, trying to understand that now her life had changed. The maid introduced herself, saying that her name was Loria, and that she was in charge of the young mistress. The girl felt a little uneasy upon hearing these words. The girl added that she would take the girl to her room, and a friendly smile appeared on her face. The girl looked around the room in surprise as they entered. It was spacious and luxurious, with exquisite decorative elements that impressed with their elegance. The girl thought that this room was more like a princess's bedroom. She was lost in thought, but soon they were interrupted by Loria, who suggested that they take a bath quickly. The maid thought for a moment, choosing her words before continuing. Her face remained calm, but her eyes reflected a slight hesitation. The maid gently explained that they needed to change clothes, and the girl, standing in the middle of the room, felt confused and bewildered. Her gaze darted around the luxurious interior. The girl happily filled the tub with clean, warm water, feeling her hands sink into the soft, soothing moisture. The warm water gave her a feeling of comfort that had been unfamiliar for so long. The girl sat in the bathtub, lost in her thoughts, while the warm water gently washed her body. Pink rose petals floated around, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility. The girl could not believe that she was really the Duke's daughter, and lightly touching her birthmark on her neck, she felt her heart beat faster. She was lost in her thoughts, thinking about how she had been a slave all her life, deprived of family and love. With each passing moment, it became harder for her to believe that now, finally, she had a chance for something more. Now she could sleep in a warm room, surrounded by soft light, and feel the warmth absorbing her fatigue. It was such a contrast to her previous life, when she slept in cold and dark corners. The sounds of water, like little drops touching the surface, continued to echo in the room, creating an atmosphere of calm. They sounded so soft and rhythmic that you could immerse yourself in that moment. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but now they were not from pain, but from relief. She felt how the heaviness that had long fettered her soul began to recede. The Duke's dining room was truly luxurious. A large oak table, covered with an exquisite tablecloth, occupied the center of the room, and on either side were chairs with deep blue seats. At one of them, at the edge of the table, sat the Duke himself, his calm but commanding gaze looking into the distance, as if he foresaw everything that was to come. Next to him, on another chair, sat a boy. They sat at the table waiting for the girl to join them before dinner began. The room was silent. Only the soft light of the candles and the firelight created a cozy atmosphere. The Duke was clearly surprised when the girl appeared in front of him. He fixed his gaze on her, as if trying to realize that what was happening was not just a dream. The girl was wearing a beautiful orange dress that matched her light hair, neatly loose and combed. She bowed her head slightly, apologizing for being late. The man came closer, carefully examining the girl, and with a warm smile said that she looked simply magnificent. His voice was filled with pride and tenderness. The man looked at the girl carefully and before dinner began, asked an important question about her name. The girl was momentarily confused because all her life she had been called simply Fifth or other impersonal nicknames. There was a moment of silence at the table after her words. The Duke frowned and the boy sitting next to him looked away. The girl continued to smile, not understanding why her name caused such a reaction. The boy looked at her cautiously, and the Duke frowned. He said softly but firmly that the number was not a name, but only a designation. The girl calmly replied that she had been called that all her life. The Duke asked the boy not to call the girl young lady, because it sounded very cold since she was now his sister. She couldn't believe that this boy was her brother. Not long ago, she was just a slave, and now she suddenly became part of the Duke's family. Her thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear. Life would never be the same again. The Duke said with a smile that now the girl would no longer need her old name, because now she would receive a new one, more suitable for her. She was very surprised by such a confession from her father. He said with a warm smile that he and his wife had chosen a name for her before she was born. It would be the name of their beloved daughter who he thought was gone. He replied that her real name was Greta. The girl looked at him in surprise. This moment was very important for both father and daughter. She looked at him in surprise, not believing her ears. Greta. The name was so unfamiliar to her since she had always been just number 5. Greta was silent, trying to comprehend the words she had just heard. A mixture of surprise and confusion raged inside her. It was so unexpected to learn her real name. Greta froze, her heart pounding. The name was familiar to her, but how? Where had she heard it before? Memories jumbled in her head, but she couldn't figure out where they were coming from. At that moment, the silence in the room seemed to break. All eyes instantly turned to Greta, who collapsed on the floor, looking stunned and frightened. The girl was unconscious. Her body lay motionless on the floor, but a single tear still rolled down her cheek, a symbol of the fact that even in the deepest darkness, traces of feelings remain. In the hallway where chaos reigned and a thunderstorm rumbled outside the window, a girl lay on the ground, her body shrouded in the shadow of pain and betrayal. The sword belonging to her older brother was stabbed into her chest, and blood slowly soaked the floor. The girl looked at her brother in horror, her eyes filled with tears and despair. With difficulty, she said the words. "Are you ready to kill your little sister?" Her voice trembled with pain. Her brother stood before her with a cold gaze, his words full of cruelty. "You were too selfish, Greta. You should have noticed it earlier." The girl felt her heart squeeze with pain. The silence in the hallway was deafening, and that single tear, slowly rolling down his cheek, seemed such a contrast to everything that was happening. She sat in a comfortable position, absorbed in the game. The trendy apartment was cozy with a modern design, bright accents, and soft lighting. The TV, which seemed to be the center of the room, displayed bright pictures, and her gaze was glued to the screen. The game was exciting, filled with tension and emotion. The images of two characters, a girl and a man who were on the verge of death, were brightly lit on the screen. The girl couldn't tear herself away from the joystick, as if this game was a part of her life. Her fingers quickly darted across the different buttons, and her gaze remained focused and interested. She looked at the screen and continued playing. Tears were running down her cheeks. The scene on TV was too tragic. A man was trying to kill the main character. At that moment, the girl thought that this heroine was a terrible villain and she had to die. But hearing her name, her own name, she suddenly remembered her past life. A life in a completely different world, where slavery was illegal. Yet even there, she was not happy. The reason for her misfortune was that her family members regularly beat her, and eventually her father killed the girl. The girl woke up and jumped out of bed in horror. Now she was no longer in the modern world, but in a world where slavery, kingdoms, and so on still existed. The girl sighed heavily when she saw that she was in a large, luxurious room. This meant that she was still in the same world. But she was afraid of the thought that one day she would have to leave it again. With a heavy heart, she realized that everything she had just seen was just a dream. When suddenly someone spoke to her, she began to look around for the source of the sound, and what she saw surprised her a little. Her older brother sat in front of her, holding a book in his hands. He looked at her tenderly, confirming that she was indeed awake. He stood up from his chair and began to approach the girl, saying that her father was very worried about her. The girl listened to him attentively. The guy added that he was glad to see her okay, but at that moment she was already replaying the most terrible moments of her dream in her head. The memories made her eyes widen and her expression became frightened. She was afraid that someday this might happen in this life. The girl was sitting on the bed. She was worried about this situation and didn't know what to do, so she just nervously squeezed the fabric of the sheet. The guy noticed this, came even closer and addressed her. Frightened, the girl immediately removed her hand and looked at him from under her brows. She was still thinking about the dream. The boy calmly said that he would inform her father of her awakening, then slowly turned around. It was obvious that he was going to leave. The door began to close slowly, leaving behind a loud sound. The girl clenched her teeth in anger. She did not expect this at all, and this dream. It made her very nervous. She clasped her hands and thought, this was not a dream at all, but a memory from a past life. Now it became clear why she remembered all this. She also realized one important thing. The body she was in belonged to a character from an automy game she played in her past life. Her name was now Greta Lindhagen. The game was called Blue Star, Flower Dance with You, and featured a princess who was looking for love while getting used to life in the palace. At first glance, this game seemed like a light love story, but the events unfolded against a backdrop of chaos. The chaos caused by the coup d'etat. Plot twists were waiting at every turn. According to the plot, Greta is Ricardo's half-sister and the main instigator of the attacks on the princess. This girl was one of the most terrifying villains in the game. Her smile was never joyful. It was sinister. She often bullied and abused the servants, treating them carelessly and cruelly. Greta put the country in danger for her own benefit because she always loved to live in luxury. She did terrible things. One of the most terrible things was that she drove her own father to despair, thereby only worsening his suffering. And in the end, she tried to kill her brother Ricardo and the main character. The girl was horrified by everything that was happening. Now she lived in this world. She was worried and tense. A single tear rolled down her cheek, reflecting all her anxiety. In the game, Greta was killed when she was 18. Although it was too young to die, she was cruel and made many enemies. However, what scared our girl most of all was that she was only 12 now. This thought brought her real horror. In other words, it could mean that in 6 years she would die or be killed. The thought of this frightened her and became more and more difficult. The girl sat on the bed, hugging herself with her arms, trying to calm down, but her thoughts were stronger than her. She thought that in her past life she had suffered the same fate. She died at the hands of her own father, as if experiencing a living death. Now, in this world, the same terrible fate awaited her. Immediately reborn, she found herself a slave, and it was unbearable. And so, finally, she met her family, but was doomed to die at their hands. She was repeating her old fate again. All of this was happening because she was a villain. The thought of literally being in her favorite game world weighed heavily on her. The girl tried to calm these thoughts, to return to reality, but everything around seemed unreal. With each new thought, she squeezed her hand harder in anger at herself. Her nails dug into her palm, causing pain. She pressed her hand to her chest and quietly said that she did not want to be killed. There was determination and heaviness in her gaze as she understood what was happening. Her look became more confident, but it was unclear what she was going to do in such a difficult situation. But there were enough thoughts. She got out of bed and continued thinking about salvation. Her main goal. She remembered how many times she had played this game and knew it almost by heart. Perhaps she would be able to avoid death. She opened the door to the balcony despite the night and knew she had to try. She looked at the night sky, which was no longer illuminated by the sun, and the moon illuminated everything around. This moment fascinated her. The girl looked confidently at the sky and said that she would definitely avoid the death flags. The girl began to close the balcony door and thought that she needed to think about what she could do in these 6 years of life that she definitely had to live. She looked around the room, trying to remember anything or understand what she needed for the future. It was important for her to find something to do that could help her in this world. Suddenly, the door burst open, and her father burst into the room, shouting her name. He looked very worried and looked around the room for her. There were tears in his eyes, and he bit his lower lip, trying to hold them back. He was panicking. The girl turned around and looked at him in surprise. His behavior seemed strange and out of place, and she didn't seem to fully understand what was happening. But her memory returned to the events of the past. He ran up to the girl and hugged her by the shoulders. She looked at him in fear, but he, holding back tears, explained that he was very worried. He added that she had slept the whole day, but the girl didn't even know what to say, so she remained silent and continued to look at him. The father, looking at her with tears, said that if something happened to her, but did not have time to finish the sentence. The girl looked at him, but soon noticed a guy appearing from behind. He came up and asked his father to calm down, looking worried as well. The father carefully laid the girl back on the bed, gently supporting her by the shoulders, and the guy watched what was happening. He apologized with a smile for disturbing her, but now his face was calm, without the previous tension and sadness. He wanted to call her Greta, but suddenly stopped, as if he remembered something, and said, "No." It seemed strange, but a smile remained on his face. He looked at her tenderly and said that they would not call her Greta. The girl was a little surprised by this turn of events. The father explained that perhaps she didn't like the name, since she even fainted when she heard it. And indeed, she did not like this name as soon as she remembered that it was connected with her past life. So the fainting was quite expected. The girl did not know what to say to her father's actions. She looked around in confusion, trying to somehow ease the situation. She wondered what he might think of her. Her father added that his wife had chosen the name, and naturally, she would not get used to it right away. He added with a smile that if she didn't like the name, they could change it. The girl thought for a moment before quietly turning to him. She wanted to say something, but only a weak "I" came out. It was hard, and she didn't know how to explain her feelings. After some thought, she said that her name was Greta, and that was her real name. She thought to herself that she had now changed her destiny, despite her past mistakes and villainies, and she intended to do everything differently. The girl smiled as if to show everyone how much she loved her name. Her soul was filled with ambitious plans for the future, and she was determined to change the fate that was destined for her. She came closer to her father and, with a warm smile, said that she liked the name very much. Without losing her cheerfulness, she added that she wanted to keep it. The man looked at his daughter carefully. His gaze dimmed, but his expression remained sad. Drops of tears glistened in the corners of his eyes as if he was in deep despair. Suddenly, he rushed to embrace her. His arms tightly closed around her fragile shoulders, and his face sank into the soft curls of his daughter. The man froze, pressing her tightly to himself. The girl was momentarily confused and a little frightened by such an unexpected impulse. The silence that reigned in the room seemed endless. He hugged the girl, the little girl even tighter and asked her to call him Daddy. After all, he always dreamed that his daughter would call him that. He also thanked her for being born and continued to hug her with all his love. Her eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected such a thing from her father, whom she had only recently met. However, she liked his sincere love. The girl hated her parents for abandoning her. She considered such an act incredibly cruel to all children. She also hated her father from her past life because he was a cruel man and never paid attention to her. But now, when her own father, with whom she had hardly communicated before, hugs her, the girl wonders, why is it that right now she feels so warm from all these emotions? The man looked at his daughter attentively, as if expecting an answer to his words spoken earlier. And suddenly he heard the word he had been waiting for so long. He smiled and tears appeared in his eyes. Her answer filled him with boundless joy and happiness. The man hugged the girl even tighter and added that he was her father. However, the girl understood for herself that this did not mean that she had to forgive everything. The girl continued to hug her father and think thoughtfully. She wanted to believe that the warmth she felt was real. She had been missing this feeling for a long time. The man asked the girl to call him Dad several times and then suddenly asked her to call him Bis. The girl thought he was too clingy and did not understand the meaning of his words. When he pressed her even harder, the girl pulled away and said that it hurt a little. The man immediately apologized, continuing to look at her with a warm smile. He looked at her tenderly and assured her that from now on he would always protect her. After all, she was now part of the family and would stay with them forever. The man put his hand on her cheek, and the girl listened attentively to his speech, watching his actions. A slight sparkle flashed in her eyes. Suddenly, her older brother entered the room. He cleared his throat, attracting attention, and the girl turned her head in his direction. The brother looked at the man carefully and with a slight smile apologized for interrupting the moment. However, he added that his sister would get married someday and would not be able to stay with their father forever. The man frowned, his gaze hardening. He hadn't seemed to think about it before, but now his face showed a deep anger that he couldn't understand. The father lowered his head. The girl began to worry about him, carefully asking what happened, but he looked desperate. Then he looked up. Tears were shining in his eyes as if he had already lost his beloved daughter, giving her to an unknown groom. He looked at her carefully, obviously thinking about something. The man took a step forward and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the room. Then, confirming his older brother's words, he quietly said, "Exactly." But suddenly, he loudly declared that in that case, he would make the girl the official heir. He thought that it was a great idea for her to stay with him longer. The elder brother was surprised to hear such a decision, because he was the one who claimed the throne. However, the man said that in any case, it was a reasonable step. In his mind, the father had already made a decision. Greta would inherit the title of Duke, and they would always be together. His eyes sparkled with determination. He came closer to the girl and knelt down in front of her. She was sitting on the bed, and he, looking straight into her eyes, said that she would become a duchess. He took her hands and said that they must find a teacher for the girl to make her a great lady. There was much to do ahead. Reading, writing, learning manners, and even dancing. The girl did not understand how everything had changed so suddenly. Was she really going to be an heiress? What lady? What dances? All this seemed distant and unreal to her. She tried to comprehend her father's words, but she felt that she could not keep up with his thoughts. She did not know how to cope with this, or what to do next. The elder brother watched the proceedings with a frown. A whirlwind of emotions raged within him. Jealousy of the father they shared, and resentment that he was being deprived of the right to the throne. The girl cast an innocent, confused look at her brother. She didn't know how to act in this situation either. The only thing she wanted was to survive in this world and keep herself safe. Suddenly, her father smiled at her and said softly that if she wanted something, she just had to ask. The girl thought for a moment and then nodded reluctantly. He added that if she wanted jewelry, dresses, sweets, or even pets, it would all be for her because she would become a duchess. The father leaned towards her and solemnly said that he swears on his name to fulfill any of her wishes. His eyes shone with sincerity and generosity. Meanwhile, the older brother began to slowly leave the room. He was unhappy with what was happening and felt left out. He walked down the long corridor, his soul seething with emotions. He had never expected that his father would treat the girl better than him, much less pass on his inheritance and title to her. Stopping in front of the door, he took hold of the handle and slowly opened it. The doors were old, and a creaking sound echoed down the hallway. Entering, he found himself in a large office. There were books on a massive table, and behind it stood a beautiful, luxurious chair. On the table lay a book called The History of the Lindhagen Family. Next to it were a pen and inkwell. Perhaps this book was kept daily, recording important events. The boy grabbed the book in a rage and threw it on the floor with all his might. Its pages scattered all over the room. He was furious about everything that was happening. Standing in front of the table, he thought. The Duke had brought back his real daughter, and now she would be the heir. He should have realized that earlier. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging painfully into his palms, leaving marks. But at that moment, he made a firm decision. He was ready to do anything to get the throne. He decided that he would never give up. The girl was lying under a blanket, and next to her stood a maid who said that she had no fever and that she just needed a good night's sleep. The girl smiled sweetly from under the blanket and thanked the maid for her kindness and care, without ever leaving her hiding place. The room was spacious, majestic, and the large bed gave it even more luxury. It was already dark, but the girl could not fall asleep, continuing to think about her life. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, but suddenly she sat up in bed. Her face became gloomy and angry, as if something was really irritating her. The girl slowly rose and walked over to the table where the book, pen, and ink lay. She looked around, put her hands on the table, and after standing for a while, picked up the pen. She began writing something down on the paper, muttering under her breath. Her face was focused, as if she had been meaning to do this for a long time. The girl said with a smile, "It's time to make a plan for the future." Her gaze shone with interest and slight excitement. The story begins with the debut of the princess heroine, who turned 18. There were many unexpected events in the game, especially for the main character. One of the conditions for passing one of the locations was a meeting with the targets of capture. The heroine had to capture the territory and choose a suitable husband. The girl's older brother was one of the candidates in the game. He looked masculine and impressive, broad shoulders, tall, and a confident look. The girl remembered that her father never said anything directly, but she had already guessed that her older brother was not his biological son. She was sure that her father had adopted the boy from some nobleman in order to make him an heir and avoid problems with children. The girl, remembering the plot, realized that she had forgotten some details, but tried to restore everything she could. Greta, his half-sister, was one of the antagonists. She hated the heroine when she started getting close to her brother. Greta mocked the heroine, enjoying her humiliation. Her cruelty and cold-bloodedness made her a dangerous enemy. Greta loved to mock people, and it brought her great pleasure. It was at the same time her strongest and most terrible power. Events led to Greta and her father joining the opponents of the crown, and Ricardo, who had become the princess's knight, became their enemy. The family was divided. Ultimately, Greta made the fatal mistake of trying to kill Ricardo, which led to her death. The girl wrote these memories down in a notebook, trying not to miss anything. She nervously wrote the letters as if her life depended on it. Her hand quickly and beautifully wrote out each letter, trying not to leave anything out. She felt that with a plan, it would be much easier for her. Suddenly, she remembered that at the time of the meeting, the heroines were 18 years old. There was very little time left for these events, and she had to be ready. She realized that there were only 6 years left before the events of the game began. Very little time to change her destiny. She needed to avoid meeting the princess and the anti-royalists in order to stay out of the plot. The girl fell on the bed, spreading her arms, and thought. For now, this is all she could think of. But there are still many plans ahead. She turned on her side and ran a hand through her golden brown hair, grinning. In fact, the best plan was to escape from this house as soon as possible. But she understood that she could not survive alone. She also began to feel the warmth of a family with her father, something she had been missing for so long. With these thoughts, she fell asleep. In the dream, a girl in an orange dress and shoes ran along the ground, as if running away from something. Her steps were loud in the silence. The wind was blowing through her hair. Her face was tense and her mouth was slightly open as she tried to catch her breath. Suddenly, she heard someone's voice. Turning around, she saw her older brother in front of her. He looked mature and manly. He held a long sword in his hands, and his gaze was heavy and anxious. His face was furious, as if he was ready to kill. He asked with cold anger where she was going. His hands tightened their grip on his sword, reflecting all the rage boiling inside him. The atmosphere became heavy and tense. Suddenly, many of the girls began to buckle, as if someone had hit them, and with a crash, they began to fall to the floor, to the ground. One of them fell so hard that it made an unpleasant sound. She landed face down, trying to somehow soften the fall with her hands. The girl raised her head in horror when she heard the sound and saw shiny shoes in front of her, approaching her. The boy placed the sword right in front of her and said that it was because of her that his father died, although he didn't directly say that she was the cause of his death. She looked up, not understanding what was happening. The girl gasped, asking him questions as if she didn't understand what he was talking about. Her eyes widened in fear, and a tear ran down her cheek, but the boy showed no mercy. He clenched his teeth, looking at her as if holding back from striking. He swung his sword and shouted at her to be quiet, calling her an evil woman, his face filled with rage and menace. The girl opened her eyes, which grew even wider when she realized it was just a dream. She found herself in a simple room without a sword in front of her. She lay on the bed in the semi-darkness without a blanket, trying to understand what had happened. She looked at the beautiful ceiling with its patterns and, with relief, realized that it was all just a dream. Nothing threatened her life, but the horror still lingered. She realized that according to the game's plot, her brother really was supposed to try to kill her, and the thought of that scared her even more. The girl fell on the bed, covering herself with her hand, and thought that her fears were real, even if they were from a dream. These thoughts continued to torment her. She stood up, wondering anxiously why her brother had decided to try to kill her. It seemed so incredibly unfair. Her gaze became more focused, as if she had realized something important that she had previously missed. Suddenly, the girl remembered something important. She clenched her fists, trying to remember all the details. What should she do now? Why did her brother decide to kill her? The sun was shining outside, and its rays penetrated the windows of the castle, illuminating everything around. On the table, there were various delicious dishes, among which was pumpkin soup, a baguette with butter, smells that beckoned with their coziness. The whole family sat at the table in silence. Everyone was absorbed in their own thoughts, not saying a word. The father, as always, sat in the middle, and the brother and sister were on his left side. The father, who was sitting in the middle of the table, was very serious. His gaze was fixed on one point. It was very quiet in the dining room. He looked at his daughter, who was carefreely eating bread and soup for breakfast, and had no idea that she would soon be dancing with joy. The father had a very grandiose plan to make his daughter happy and make her dance with joy. He was already anticipating her reaction. The man prepared a surprise for his daughter, a cute teddy bear. He was sure that this gift would make her happy and would be a memory of him. The man was already imagining how the girl would grab him in her arms, and he would see how she would shine with happiness, and he would be able to look at her happy face. While the man was working out his plan, his face became much happier, and a slight blush appeared on his cheeks. But the children could not understand this at all. The man reached for a cup of delicious and fragrant coffee that he wanted to drink. Suddenly, someone interrupted him, and he stopped, holding the cup in his hands. The girl looked at him seriously and said that she had a request for him. It was a little unexpected and even strange on the girl's part, because she had never asked for anything before. The father was even glad about this event and immediately asked again what she wanted. His face became even more cheerful, but he did not let her speak and, interrupting, said that she could say nothing because he had already prepared everything. But before he could finish, the girl also made her voice, interrupting his cheerful speech. The girl answered seriously and firmly that she wanted to learn sword fighting. After that, there was silence in the room. The man froze, and there was a slight misunderstanding in his eyes. He did not understand his daughter's desire at all and only looked at her as if she was joking, or it did not happen at all. He didn't expect this from his daughter because he thought that she would want dresses, gifts, and other various things, but clearly not fencing lessons. The father asked about the bear in a very strange way. He added his speech about fencing, but the girl was already in her thoughts, because if she at least learned to hold a sword in her hands, then it would not be so easy to kill her. At that moment, the girl was full of confidence, but now she is already standing with a sword in her hands and waiting for a fight with the guy. And then the duel between the rivals began. And the next moment, the young man struck so hard that his rival could not hold her sword. It tore out of her hands and fell with a ringing sound onto the stone surface of the ground. The girl was very upset by what happened. Her hands hurt a lot after this fight. She looked at them with pity. Immediately after this, a naked sword appeared in front of her, with which her successful rival decided to threaten her. The young man didn't even think of pouring it on her. There was malice in his eyes, and in his hand a sword was shining, stretched out in her direction. They continued to stand opposite each other. the unarmed girl and the young man pointing a gun at her face. She wondered why this death flag was so close to her. A couple of days before these events, everything seemed completely different. When Greta came to her father with a request, he asked her if she could repeat it again. She did so willingly and said again that she really wanted to learn fencing. Her voice sounded confident. The older brother, who was sitting at the table, chuckled at the girl's words. It seemed that he did not really believe in her abilities. She was very surprised by the man's behavior. She looked at him, not understanding that she was the reason for his laughter. He answered without even hearing her question. The boy said that he was always ready to protect her, and that should be enough. She still didn't want to be protected, and she openly told her interlocutor about it. He asked her if she meant by this that she didn't trust him. It seemed that the atmosphere at the table had become noticeably tense, and it was necessary for her father to calm it down. He asked if this meant that she was still going to take up fencing. The girl's father said he was very interested in what she asked for. Previously, he thought it would be dresses, jewelry, or toys. The Duke even laughed and said that he never thought that she would ask him to teach her fencing. The man looked sincere. He told her that he didn't look like he was the best swordsman in their entire kingdom. During his conversations, he extended his hand closer to his daughter. He then stroked his daughter's head and told her that since she was his daughter, he was ready to fulfill any of her wishes. The girl heard that the best fencing teacher would be found for her. A sparkle appeared in her eyes because she had achieved her goal. She did not hide her joy that her hidden wish would be fulfilled and began to thank her father. After this, her brother became very angry. He stood up from the table and shouted that he was against it. His face instantly became angry and furious. The sister could not understand his behavior. His statement only caused her bewilderment. Still, she really wanted to learn fencing. Greta jumped up from the table and told her brother that he had no right to forbid her anything. The father tried to calm his children down to avoid conflicts. Then the father thought he could find the perfect solution to this situation. He turned to the boy and told him that he would be the one to do it. He would teach Greta fencing. The boy was stunned by his father's words. Apparently, he expected him to forbid his daughter from fencing, but it turned out that he himself had to teach her. The daughter couldn't accept her father's decision either. She didn't imagine her teacher like that at all. She and her older brother clearly didn't have the best relationship, but the father had no intention of changing his mind. He said that he had personally taught Ricardo how to wield a sword, and if he personally took on Greta's training, then there would be nothing to worry about. So it was decided that the girl's brother would be the one to teach her fencing. The children stood before their father and could not say anything. The man seemed amused by his decision, saying it would be a great opportunity for his children to bond with each other. So said her father, and the girl was forced to agree with him. From then on, her lessons with her brother began. She persistently tried to show him all her strength, but now she felt bad. It was all because of the way her brother imagined her education. Something about this didn't smell like rapprochement at all. The boy continued to point his sword at her, and then asked her if she wanted to continue. His gaze was noticeably clouded, and it was visible. The girl thought that he had already stopped glaring at his sister and pointing a gun at her. Their father was watching everything that was happening between the children from the side. He held a stuffed animal in his hands. The man said that it seemed that his children had already started to get along with each other, and he was right. He held out a teddy bear in front of him and asked him if he thought the same. The father looked quite happy and joyful, like a child. The toy was blue and looked quite cute. It was a small teddy bear. It had very beautiful eyes and a nose. The man was clearly in a playful mood. He started talking to the toy and told her that he would give it to Greta someday, so there was no reason for him to be sad. The father carried the teddy bear to his room. He said that he should stay there for now. The maids wondered what kind of toy it was and why he was talking to it. In the courtyard in front of the palace, events unfolded as before. The brother simply laughed at his sister. He had already lowered his sword and turned to walk away, but the girl screamed at him to wait. She didn't like that he told her that she couldn't even hold a sword properly, so there was no point in continuing their training anymore. The boy said that he really appreciated his sister's enthusiasm, but she was too weak. She couldn't even increase her training, so it was useless to continue. The girl did not leave her brother behind, despite the offensive words. He again suggested that she give up this idea. He was heading out of the garden. At some point, she even thought that he was absolutely right, and she had nothing to say to him. These thoughts weighed on the girl, and she became sad. But still, despite everything, she absolutely did not want to give up now. because she thought that in this way she would not be able to change her fate. Then the girl turned to her brother again and asked him to give her another chance. She slowly took the sword in her hands and waited for the boy's answer, but he did not pay attention. She said that they should try one more time. Her look was confident. The girl decided to fight and study with her older brother until the end. The girl held her wooden sword in front of her with determination and looked at her opponent with a determined gaze. One would think that she was ready for anything. Something in his sister's eyes surprised the boy. He couldn't understand what had suddenly happened to her. The dark-haired boy was surprised by her determination, and then he said a word that surprised the girl very much. He said only one word: 100. She didn't even understand what these words meant, and while she was thinking, how could this be? He added that every day she would have to do 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and 100 sword swings. After that, the fencing teacher turned around and started to leave. He told her that if she could handle it, he would teach her. The girl tried to stop him in vain. Nothing helped, and she noticed with confusion that he had indeed left, leaving her alone. She did not understand what she needed to do and decided to begin anyway. Greta thought that now she had hope, but for it to come true, she still had to put in a lot of effort. She agreed with her brother and put her weapon aside for a while. This was a very important moment because in this case, her studies would continue. The girl started doing push-ups and decided that 100 push-ups weren't that bad for her. She happily landed on the ground and froze in a plank pose, but it seemed she was a little mistaken, and soon her hands began to shake. It was a sign of fatigue and future pain in the whole body. Exhausted and still not having completed the 100 push-ups, she fell onto the rocks. Her fall was very loud and the girl felt pain. The girl did not understand what had happened to her, because in her past life she had never had any problems with push-ups. She lay there and thought about how while she was a slave, she had hardly eaten at all, and she had no thoughts. But then she remembered her brother's words as he left. He had told her that until she could handle it, he was not going to teach her. This memory made her stand up. That's why Greta thought that the problem wasn't her skills. It was probably something else. She rubbed her hands together tiredly. Standing up in the ground, the girl looked at her hands and thought that she had a very unadapted body for life, since it was weaker than her previous one, and with it she would never be able to cope with the task. She was just upset that she had to do 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and 100 sword swings every day. But then she remembered what would happen if she failed, so she clenched her fist and began doing push-ups again. She mentally ordered that there should be no "I can't." She commanded her body and ordered it to rise. She then continued her work, frightening a hare in the meantime, who jumped over her body. She shouted at him not to disturb her. After that, it was time for sword training. The girl worked hard to do 100 swings with this weapon. She tried to do everything as quickly as possible. She worked on these exercises with worthy persistence. A voice sounded in her head that helped her solve the problem and do all the exercises. Greta couldn't stop for a moment. Otherwise, she would disappoint her brother and he would refuse to study with her. The girl stubbornly twirled her sword. While she was learning to hold the sword firmly and swing it powerfully, a young man was watching her closely from around the corner. It was her father. It seemed to her that this activity would never end, but now she had counted to 900 sword swings. It seemed that this was a completely unrealistic number, but at that moment she felt that her body was aching and her hands were shaking. The girl was tired of all the exercises and wanted to rest. She would have liked to repeat this exercise 100 more times, and for this she only gripped the sword tighter. The girl was not ready to give up and continued. The father, who was watching his daughter, came out of his hiding place and asked her not to overexert herself. She was a little frightened by the appearance of the man. The girl replied that she was perfectly fine. She was not tired at all and she enjoyed these activities. Her smile meant that everything was fine and she did not need help. She added that her father could go into the house and in the meantime she would study here a little longer. But her father extended his hand closer to the girl. Then the man took his daughter's hand and turned it palm up so she could see it. It had a lot of calluses on it that had appeared recently. Greta was puzzled to see that her palm was covered in blisters. Her father told her that maybe she should stop after all, but Greta responded by telling him that she had not finished her studies yet. She absolutely had to finish them. She was worried because she wanted to extend her studies. It seemed that her father had foreseen this development, because he pulled out a jar of grease from somewhere and began to smear it on his daughter's palm. After he did this, the pain subsided a little, although at first it stung a little. The girl watched everything that was happening carefully. Dad told her that this ointment heals calluses very well. He looked sincere and calmly and waited for his daughter's answer. There was a small smile on his face. The grateful girl said thank you to her father. She felt the warmth from the man and was surprised by his affection and kindness. Greta was calm, but also joyful, and indeed, after a while, the pain in her palms completely disappeared, and she felt good again. She smiled, looking at her hand. Greta waved her sword at her father and told him that she could now continue practicing, while her brother watched them closely. Judging by the boy's appearance, one would think that he was not at all pleased with the scene that had just taken place before his eyes. He turned around and quickly began to walk away from the place where his sister continued to study. It seemed that he was disappointed in something. A month later, significant events took place in the life of the palace. Near the place where the girl had previously trained with her older brother, it was quiet, but voices were heard. The maids watched in amazement what was happening before their eyes. They were alarmed and could not tear their eyes away from the boy's latest performance. It seemed that the young fencer had not spent this month in vain and could now stand up to her brother. The boy fought his sister on equal terms. Greta was pleased that she was finally being trained, but she still couldn't do anything about her opponent. This thought irritated her and made her feel weak. She understood that her brother was probably a real talent, and it was not for nothing that their dad trained him. You would think that the girl would never beat him. It was very difficult for her to resist him in fencing. He was a skilled player of the spikes, but the girl did not give up. She gathered all her strength and continued to fight, but what struck her most was the way he did it. She couldn't understand his emotions. She looked at her opponent with attention and determination. The boy was also amazed. He thought that she must have been tired by now, but she had a look that she had definitely inherited from their father. Yes, she had the spirit of the swordsman, and she was a true heir to the Lindhagen blood. Another confirmation of this was the rose. Such an unexpected thing, but also very important. Very few people had this birthmark, and it was clear that she was of ducal blood. The boy was most irritated by the fact that his sister had everything he lacked. This thought irritated and angered him, making him clench his teeth hard. He thought about why he found her at all. After all, if it weren't for her, he would feel differently. But he thought too long and saw the girl wielding a sword. The girl kept striking her opponent with her sword. It seemed that she was not tired at all. Her eyes were filled with confidence in her own strength and an irresistible desire to win. At some point, it got to the point where the boy was simply stunned by her actions. The young swordswoman's sword was just a few centimeters from his face. Now he couldn't play Podolki. He had to fight her with all his strength. He was amazed that she had achieved such success in such a short time. When the guy saw that the girl was not going to retreat at all and was confidently wielding her sword, he struck her sword with all his might, gritting his teeth in anger. The blow was so powerful that the girl stepped back. Her hand went weak, and his next blow landed right on her thigh. She was stunned and scared. A few moments later, she fell to the floor with a thud, making strange sounds of pain. The guy froze in shock. He didn't understand what to do and what would happen now, because he had hurt his sister. The girl lay unconscious on the ground, curled up. Her wooden sword lay next to her. The maids immediately ran up to her, trying to bring her to consciousness. And the boy stood behind, gloomy and confused. It seemed that he was completely alone and only his sister lay before him. His gaze was strange, not joyful, not angry, but filled with fear and remorse. He stood there for a long time, unable to move. His inner state was getting worse, as if there was a hard struggle going on inside him. Later, the boy was sitting on the floor of a room. In front of him stood the woman who had just slapped him. He was holding his cheek. The woman was beside herself with rage. She screamed at the boy, calling him a demon who wanted to kill her child, and pointed her finger at him. The guy was scared. He clearly didn't expect such a turn of events. Tears were running down his cheeks. He tried to justify himself, but the words got stuck in his throat. He made strange sounds, attracting the attention of the maids. They looked at him, but did not understand anything, because their attention was focused on the girl. After some time, the girl began to open her eyes, lying in a warm bed. She opened only one eye, as the bright sun was shining directly into her face. She sat up and looked around. The room was as luxurious as ever, but she was surprised to see no one inside. As she continued to look around, she realized that it was her own room. At that moment, she heard a joyful cry. Someone was calling her, and she turned her head towards the sound. The maid ran up to her and hugged her with all her might, joyfully exclaiming that it was good that the girl had finally woken up. She squeezed her in her arms as if she did not want to let go. The maid pulled back a little and said that the girl had slept for 2 whole days and they didn't know what to do. But the girl smiled and assured her that everything was fine. The girl thought, surprised that she had slept for 2 whole days due to fatigue and the blow. Her body was still weak, but thoughts about what had happened lifted her spirit. She firmly said that she would train even harder so that she could dodge it next time. The maid looked at her in surprise. They also reminded the girl about her brother and tried to add something, but she was already immersed in her thoughts. Thoughtfully looking at the maid, the girl seemed not to hear their words. The room was cozy and simple. White walls with wooden beams, a table with a lamp and a plant, a shelf with books and small items, wooden buckets in the corner, and a striped carpet on the floor. The guy sat on the bed in this gloomy room, lost in his dark thoughts. He clenched his chin, lost in his dark thoughts, and remembering the woman's words, quietly said, "I am a demon." With the same sadness, he let go of his chin and turned his gaze to the bed, thoughtfully saying to himself that this was precisely why there was no place for him here. The girl asked the maid in surprise about her brother and said that he hid in the attic and refused to eat. The girl listened in surprise, and the maid only confirmed and said that the boy called himself a demon and ran away. The girl thought about it because it was very strange, since it was not in his description, and asked how Dad was. The maid explained that he had been summoned to the palace and had not heard from him for several days. If this continued, her brother might suffer. The maid gently took the girl by the hand and, turning to her, said that she had a request. She, holding her hands, asked to convince Mr. Ricardo to come down. The girl looked at the maid in surprise. It was known that the boy grew up in a village and was raised by his mother. They were not rich, but it was a very happy time for the young man. But one day, tragedy struck. A fire broke out in his house when he was only 7 years old, and it took everything from him. Later, a man came to him and asked if he was Ricardo, and then explained that he was a servant of Count Sainara and had come to take him away. That day, everything changed for the boy. He stood in shabby clothes in a beautiful room, one might say royal, because that's what it looked like. The woman in the green dress with dark brown hair said she was glad to meet him. She smiled tenderly at him and said that he could call her mother. He lowered his head in confusion and still called her mother, agreeing with her. As it turned out, the boy's mother was a servant of the Sainara house, and he was the illegitimate son of the count, so they decided to adopt him. The Duchess was unable to give birth, so she treated the boy as her own child, but it didn't last long. His half-brother was born, who was named Luke. Since then, the boy became an empty space for the entire mansion. This led him to great bitterness. One day, the boy went somewhere. He slowly opened the door so that no one could hear and went inside. He looked at the little child, his half-brother. He was cute enough and looked like his mother, but the boy was upset. He sat near the crib, looked at the baby, and was gloomy and disappointed. The boy touched his brother gently, as if afraid of frightening him, but he was sleeping peacefully. He leaned even closer to him and stroked his head. He, too, was sleeping peacefully, enjoying his sleep. The boy looked at him with a slight smile and thought that this child was very cute and looked like an angel. But then a woman burst into the room and screamed in anger or fear when she saw the boy standing by the crib. The woman grabbed her face with her hands and screamed loudly, asking what he was doing. The boy happily came closer to his mother and wanted to explain something, but she did not let him say a word. A terrible atmosphere reigned between them. The boy hoped that he would be praised for his love and affection for his brother, because they were supposed to have an ideal family, as they had shown him earlier. But the woman swung and slapped the child with all her might. He, not expecting this, could not understand what was happening. His eyes darted around the room, trying to understand the reason for this action from his mother, because this had never happened before, and no one had ever hurt him. The woman pulled her hand away and, with a frowning face, screamed in rage that he was a demon and was trying to kill her child. The boy looked at her fearfully, holding his cheek. He turned to her and asked what she was talking about. But the woman answered that he was afraid that his younger brother would take everything away from him. The woman continued to beat the child, asking how he dared to touch his younger brother and what he had done to him. Eventually, the boy lay unconscious on the floor. The woman stopped her actions only when the little boy from the crib began to scream and cry. She turned her attention to him. She walked up to the crib, picked up the child, apologized, and began to calm the baby down. She continued to hold the baby in her arms and speak kind words to him, but the boy, trembling, drew up his legs and wanted to say that she had not understood everything that way at all. But he was interrupted. She shouted at him not to come near her and not to dare to call her mother. It was quite rude of her. She called a servant and ordered someone to come here and immediately take the boy, calling him a demon, to the attic. He tried to resist, but it was useless. They took him up to the attic. It was a gloomy room, and they closed the door noisily, leaving the boy alone with his thoughts. The boy immediately ran to the door and started knocking on it, asking for forgiveness and saying that he hadn't done anything. Panic was growing inside him. Tears were already appearing in his eyes, and he added that everything was not like that at all. And now, in the attic, which had changed a lot, there was a grown-up boy, still sad about what he had done, but this time he felt even worse. He was sure that he would be thrown out again. The girl decided to fulfill the maid's request. She was getting closer and closer to the door to the attic. She wondered how she could convince him. She stood frozen at the door, wondering what would happen if she brought about the end herself. But her thoughts were interrupted by a voice coming from the other side. Someone called her by name, and she felt a little scared. After thinking for a moment, she realized it was her brother and called out to him. He absent-mindedly replied that he was glad the girl was okay. The girl smiled and confirmed that she was fine and asked why he didn't come out of the attic. The boy was still standing by the door and listening to what the girl was saying. She added that everyone was saying that he hadn't eaten anything at all, and everyone was very worried. But he replied that they had no reason to worry, because it was his punishment. He also added that the girl should not worry, because he would not approach her anymore. She was a little surprised, not understanding why he was saying that. But in the end, she thought that if in this case the bad ending of her life would be canceled, then she felt a little happy for herself. The girl decided to pull the door handle, but it was locked. After a while, she realized that there was no point in trying again. She shouted from behind the door that this would not work at all, continuing to try to open the door. The guy, hearing her voice, got a little scared and started looking around. She continued to pound on the door and scream. Why did she train so much if it was all useless now? The girl said that she couldn't let her death flag fly on its own. The guy got even more scared, not understanding what she was talking about, and asked her to stop pounding on the door. But the girl didn't listen to him at all. But after a few tries, she firmly said that she was going to go in. And to her surprise, the door actually opened. The girl did not expect this and began to fall forward, completely unaware of what was happening. She was scared when she realized that the door had suddenly opened and now she was falling straight onto the floor. The guy standing behind the door quickly reacted and caught her by the arm so that she wouldn't fall. He looked confused, and it was obvious to the naked eye. He had absolutely no idea why the door had suddenly opened. The girl was no less surprised. It was strange for her to be so close to this man, on whom, in her opinion, her life depended. She looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. And now she found herself literally in the arms of the man she feared. Having gathered herself, she turned to the door and began to knock on it from the other side. However, the door did not give in, as if it was no longer possible to open it. She tried again and again, but soon realized that it was pointless. Stopping, the girl turned to the boy. She looked at him with concern, and he looked at her with the same concern. They stood next to each other at the door. The girl was terrified by the thought of staying in this room with him. Her imagination painted the most terrible scenarios, and these thoughts only made her feel worse and worse. The servants gathered around the door to the attic and tried to open it, without hovering around it, namely a man and two girls. The man sadly turned to the children outside the door and said that he was very sorry, but it seemed that the lock had been damaged due to the strong impact. The girl was a little surprised by these words, because she didn't even know what to do now and how to fight the guy alone. The man added that he would call a plumber, but he would need time, and so the girl and the boy stand near the door alone. They are both silent and do not know what to say to each other. The atmosphere in the room was quite heavy. Hearing that they couldn't get out of here, they began to disperse, both not knowing what to do. An awkward silence hung in the room. The guy sat down on the bed, frowning, and the girl stood there, not knowing what to do because she was left alone in the room with her death flag. This was not good at all. The girl was silent for a long time, but the guy decided to make the first move. He said that they could now discuss everything at once. He began his speech and said that the difference between her... He paused briefly. He added that between him too, but the girl did not understand this at all. He said it was blood. The girl found it strange to hear this, and she didn't understand what it was all about. but the guy looked pretty gloomy. He, looking at the floor, added that he did not have any birthmark like the girl. His voice sounded very sad and weak. The girl fidgeted a little as she listened to his speech and picked up the place where her birthmark was. She had known for a long time that there was some difference between them, but she didn't think he knew about it. He continued and added that despite the absence of a birthmark, he was brought to this house for the purpose of being raised as a future heir, and that was why his father took him away. As he spoke, he clutched the sheet as if all these words were very difficult for him to say. He felt very ridiculous. He also added that now his sister, that is, the girl as a real daughter, will inherit the title. And now the girl began to understand everything. He added that he believed he had a chance and refused to give up, but in the end, the boy still injured the girl. He looked quite sad and upset. He lowered his head and covered it with his hand, adding that now it was all over and he had no choice anymore. The boy looked very gloomy. He added that he had no choice precisely because he was a demon. The girl could not stand it and still decided to tell him something. She did not understand at all where he got this demon and punishment from, but she knew for sure that he was not sad entirely because of her. She came closer to him and said that in that case she would also speak out. The girl decided to tell him everything. She put her hands on her hips and, looking at the guy, said that she was not going to become an heiress at all, which surprised the guy very much. He looked at the girl in surprise, as if he didn't understand the meaning of her words at all. The boy clearly didn't expect such a turn of events, but the girl with shining eyes answered that she would live as she wanted and create her own destiny. It was at that moment that she was very happy. She turned back, but still added that she thought she would leave someday. He couldn't believe his ears and eyes. The guy was sure that the girl wouldn't be able to live on her own. The girl just asked in surprise because he should have known that in the past she was a slave and finding a job for her was not a problem at all. The girl turned around and started doing some kind of exercise, that is, stretching. She replied that the people in the mansion were very nice, but the life of a young lady was not for her. The girl walked around the room and thought that she didn't know if this guy would believe her. But he replied that she wouldn't be able to do everything she had planned. He looked at her and explained that his father would never allow this to happen. And if she left, he would find her in a flash and bring her back. The girl was a little upset when she thought that such an outcome of events was really possible, but she was amused that her brother was thinking about it. She thought for a moment and then answered the guy that in that case she needed to make sure that her father didn't interfere. She began to look around the room as if looking for a way out in her things. After a few minutes, the girl finally found a solution. She pointed her index finger at the guy's face and shouted that she had a solution. She also mysteriously and loudly shouted that she had a plan to drive Dad crazy. The boy watched his sister in surprise. She looked rather strange because when she spoke about her strange plan, she smiled and pointed her finger at him. This confused the young man a little, and now they were sitting on the bed and the girl was asking the guy about his impression of her plan. It was pretty cute. He looked at her, turning around, and said that he didn't think it would go so smoothly. But she put her hand on his shoulder, and slightly grabbing him by the thing he was wearing, she said, even shouted, that now was not the time to doubt. She moved her face even closer to him and shouted that this was all so that everything would work. He had to help the girl. His sister's actions made his brother a little scared, and a slight blush of embarrassment appeared on his face. He turned around and stepped back, saying that he would help, for which the girl thanked him. When the boy turned around, the girl added that she had one more question, which made the boy look at her. He turned back to her, and she carefully asked if the guy had done it on purpose, because she was sure of the opposite. He remembered with horror the moment when, during training, he accidentally hit her with all his might in the stomach and the thigh area. He clasped his hands together and agreed with the girl, explaining that he himself had not noticed how he began to attack her in response, and that it was somehow reflexive. He looked sad, looked at the floor, and replied that he had not wanted to hurt the girl at all. His voice sounded sincere. Small drops of tears were visible on the boy's face. She replied that in that case the guy was not a demon. He was a little surprised, and she explained that she had hit him first, and there was no point in blaming himself. She also waved her finger and said that the more everyone was worried about him, the less justified it was. She looked very serious, and she added again that in that case he was not a demon at all. The guy listened to her speech in surprise, and in the end decided to turn to her. But she only started repeating her plan. The beautiful, majestic, and large castle rose in its glory. From the sun, its entire surface glowed very beautifully, giving a special beauty to the palace. The fair-haired man, or rather the father of two children who were now locked in the attic, appeared before the king. He bowed to him and asked why the king had summoned him, addressing him with respect. The king was quite an important person. The king was the owner of the kingdom of Aselna. His name was Zeras. He was a gray-haired man with bright green eyes. He answered that he had one thing to do and remembered his daughter Greta. And he also remembered the son of the Grand Duke of Sharma. His words created a strange tension and atmosphere, and the man froze in anticipation of further words. The man froze when he heard the king add his comment about them, namely that he was planning to betroth them. His face literally contorted in shock. The man clenched his fist at the king's speech about his own daughter. He didn't like the idea of an engagement at all. The king explained this by saying that with the influence and connections of the Grand Duke, the man's position would be strengthened, and in his opinion, this was not a bad idea at all. If we talk about the Grand Duchy of Charm in more detail, they have such power that they are called the second royal family. The man was angry for his daughter because the king wanted to use Greta as a tool. However, he replied that this was not necessary at all. He continued to insist on his own, and also added that if the king was so interested in the power of the Grand Duchy, then wouldn't it be better for him to betroth their son to Princess Marielle? The king's mouth dropped open and he became nervous. He wanted to say something, but he was interrupted. The father continued to kneel before the steps, and the king sat in his place. However, the man firmly insisted on his own and did not think of giving up his daughter. He said that he understood the situation perfectly, but there were not the best rumors about that child. The eldest son of the House of Charm was de Goyle. He was only 12 years old, but they say that this boy is as cunning as a snake. The man lowered his head and calmly said that he had finally returned his dear daughter and wanted to find her a worthy groom. The king staggered a little at the man's words and cried out, asking where he would find a more suitable option, insisting on the correctness of his proposal. However, the man's gaze remained confident and firm. He looked straight into the king's eyes. The king, despite this, continued his annoying speech. The king chuckled and pointed his finger at the man, telling him not to even think about using his adopted son for this, because this dirty boy does not know his place. These words made the man angry, and he hit the tiles with his fist. The man could not calm down after the king's words about his son and shouted furiously that he was not at all as he was described. One could say that the king was even frightened by such anger from the duke and shrank back in his comfortable chair. The man was still seething with indignation, but he seemed more balanced. He straightened up, stood up, and began his speech about the rumors. He looked straight at the king and said that his son would never have raised a hand against his brother and that no one had even tried to listen to him. The man could not stand it, turned sharply and headed for the exit, notifying the king about it. The king, not expecting such a sharp turn, tried to stop him. The man walked angrily down the corridor, clenching his palms. Heavy thoughts awaited him in the long corridor. As soon as he went further, a servant ran up to him, shouting something. But the man, irritated, thought that 2 days of waiting for a conversation about an ordinary marriage had been in vain. His mood was getting worse. He looked at the servant and asked if it was urgent. The servant, out of breath, said that he had just received news from the mansion. The servant told him that the man's children were locked in the attic. These words clearly frightened him, making him very nervous. Meanwhile, the weather outside was beautiful. The green trees rustled in the gusts of a light wind, and the birds twittered cheerfully on the branches. The girl carefully opened one eye as the bright sunlight was blinding her. She did not immediately understand where she was and why everything around was so bright. Looking around, she noticed that she was lying on a bed. Next to the bed, with his head on the edge, a boy was sleeping. The girl wondered how it happened that she fell asleep without noticing it. She yawned, covering her mouth with her hand, and went back to thinking. They discussed their plan until they both fell asleep, and by that time the lock should have been fixed. The girl screamed when she heard a loud and sharp noise. The boy immediately woke up, opening his eyes. The father called out loudly to the children, asking if they were all right. Both were slightly frightened, as they had not expected to see him at all. The girl tried to get out of bed. The man assured them that Dad was here and would save them. She stood waiting, worried about what he was going to do because the door was still locked. The boy had the same excited and frightened emotions. He couldn't even imagine what could happen next, and every new thought caused even more anxiety. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the father appeared before the children, having knocked down the door. He looked like a hero from a movie, and this act seemed extremely brave. The man looked at the children and asked if they were okay. However, they looked scared. The girl was scared because of the noise, and the boy looked strangely worried. The boy narrowed his eyes slightly, his face expressing anxiety. He thought that his father would now start yelling at him and blaming him for hurting his sister. Contrary to his expectations, the man hugged both children and admitted that he was very worried about them. It was a touching moment that reflected family love. The boy looked over his father's shoulder in fear. This turn of events was unexpected for him. He couldn't even predict whether the continuation would be good or bad. The man said he nearly fainted when he learned the children were stuck in the attic. He immediately saddled his horse and headed out to find them. He leaned over to the girl and asked if it was true that she was injured and if she was okay. The girl, with a hesitant smile, confirmed that everything was fine. Now the man turned to the boy, saying that they needed to talk about the injury of Greta, their sister. The boy became visibly nervous. He tried to say something, but due to excitement, he could not connect words into sentences, only issuing fragments of phrases. The man gently placed his hands on his son's shoulders and said with a smile that the most important thing was that they were both alive and well. This sounded unexpected to the boy. The boy squeezed his palm and, exhaling nervously, said that the girl was also very important to him. A tense silence hung in the room. He added that he doesn't even have a birthmark, and therefore he cannot be an heir, which means he is superfluous here. The man was stunned and alarmed by his son's words. He could not even imagine that the boy carried such pain inside himself. Closing his eyes, the man began to speak in a calm voice. He recalled that they had spent many years together while the girl was away. He assured that all this time he had been caring for the boy, wanting to make him his heir, and never wanted to hurt him. The man told how he watched the boy grow up and was proud of him. It was touching because he genuinely cared about his son. He also mentioned that he had lost his wife and daughter, and the boy had become his only joy. The man admitted that it was thanks to the boy that he found the strength to live on. He gently took the boy's hand, saying warmly that nothing had changed since then. With a smile and sincerity, the man apologized for not speaking about it before. Now he wanted to express his feelings. Holding his son's hands, he added that the birthmark did not matter because he would always be a precious son to him. Tears came to the boy's eyes. The man also smiled and said that questions about the heir could be discussed later. The girl looked at everything with joy and warmth. She was happy, thinking to herself that now there would be no difference between her and her brother. But suddenly something strange happened to her. Her gaze became cloudy, and she seemed to be transported to another world, where she complained to her father about her brother, blaming him. She screamed, demanding that her father punish the boy. He stood aside, frightened and stunned by her words, not expecting such betrayal. The girl smiled in her father's arms, looking like a creepy villain, and called her brother a real demon. The boy was shocked and devastated. His gaze became dull, and pain appeared in his eyes. It was as if a part of his soul had been destroyed. In reality, the girl suddenly came to herself. She was scared and covered her mouth with her hands, shocked and frightened. She did not understand at all what had just happened to her and why she had imagined it.